Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. Very quickly, some updates real quickly before we begin. First off, welcome back to CAE Forum. It's going to be pretty much the same format as previous CAE forums. You guys as attendees will not have microphone privileges. If you guys have a question that you guys would like to ask the speaker, please write it in the chat box below. So that way the speaker can address your question when the speaker chooses to. Typically, we kind of assert that the presenter will get to your guys' comments or questions at the end, but they also have the ability to answer your questions as they go along if they so choose. So just a reminder that if you guys do write in the chat box, we will revisit that later on. Next item, this CAE Forum talk is going to be recorded and posted on the CAE and Cybersecurity Community website. I'll post a link in the chat box, so that way you guys can go back and find it. So today we're going to hear from Laura Edelson from New York University. So take it away, Laura.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. So I will be trying to take questions at the end of every section, and we'll see how that goes. So just a little bit of background about the political ad libraries and why they exist to sort of get us going. I'm sure everyone in this crowd is familiar with the Russian disinformation campaigns during the election of 2016. A lot of content like this was promoted on Facebook, things like this, and 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 this. So the purpose of a lot of this content was to, sort of spread division, and a lot of it was targeted at different specific communities that were focused around some kind of metric of identity. So these are inauthentic communities in the language of Facebook. So there were two big reactions to this. One, the three major platforms all put some form of restriction on political advertisers. Very specifically, they all required some form of disclosure of the payer for political advertising, and this, this disclosure did vary by platform, but everyone had something. And all three platforms also began engaging in some form of verification of the identity of political advertisers. And again, this varied by the platform. Also, there were some restrictions that were put in place in terms of who could pay for that political advertising, and those restrictions were usually geographic. So in the case of the United States, this usually meant that in order to run an ad that was deemed political by the varying definitions that these platforms employed, you had to be located in the United States or have some agent who was. And the other big thing that happened is all three major platforms launched some form of transparency archive for political content. And just one thing I'm going to note, this is probably the last time I'm going to use the word political, because the platforms themselves really tried to avoid that language, and I will as well. So these archives launched on May 7th in 2018, May 31st in 2018, and June 28th. So really all about the same time, because they were very much in reaction to the same events. So just a brief overview of each of these three platforms. So Facebook made their transparency platform available over a web portal initially and eventually over an API. That web portal is available to anyone with or without a Facebook account, doesn't matter. The API is only available to people who register as, with a Facebook developer account and who agree to the specific terms of service of the ad library API. The information that you can get in the transparency archive is the specific ads text, image, and video information, some impression and spend information, although that is in buckets. And I'll show you what I mean about that in a little bit. You can see a demographic and geographic distribution of spend, and some advertiser specified information about how that ad would be run. So that's the start date, the end date of the ad, and advertisers also needed to provide a disclosure string stating who paid for the ad. And also the page, the Facebook page that the ad ran against. Google did things a little bit differently. They also had a web portal, but they also had a BigQuery data set. If you're not familiar with BigQuery, it's like a Google Cloud product that allows the storage of SQL-like data sets and a SQL-like interface to those data sets. Those are available to anyone with no login required, but the data here is a little bit different. You cannot see the ad text in that data set, but you can get a link to the composed ad for non-third-party ads. And let me just pause to explain that briefly. Google has an extensive ad network, and it has an extensive network of partners who sell ad space, usually as part of some real-time auction. Ads that are sold through those third-party partners are not made available, or rather the content is not made available through either of these methods. You will just see like a placeholder card that says, you know, this ad was bought through a third party. But it does give you some limited impression and spend information, the demographic and geographic targeted groups, if any, the start and end date of the ad, and the vetted advertiser information. So Google has a narrower criteria for inclusion than Facebook does, and this allows them to fully vet the advertisers who meet their criteria for inclusion. So they provide an FEC ID or an EIN for all those advertisers. Lastly, Twitter. So the Twitter transparency portal was web portal only. It was also accessible to anyone, no login required. But they did make quite a lot of information available for those ads. We were able to retrieve the ad text, the image, the video. We were able to get exact, so they publish exact impression and spend information, not bucketed. They also give a demographic and geographic distribution of those impressions and spend, and of course the start and end date of the ad, and the billing information for the ad payer. That's what they make transparent. But important note here that Twitter will no longer be accepting political advertising as of the end of the month. So this is sort of a somewhat closed book, as since they're no longer accepting political advertising, they will cease to be making any new information transparent. So just a quick overview of what the relative scale of these archives are. So Facebook has about $888 million of spend in their library since May of last year. Google has 126 million, and Twitter has less than 5 million in a roughly comparable time frame. So that should give you some perspectives on the relative size of the data that we're working with here. And here I will again just note that these platforms have different criteria for inclusion. So these scales are not just a reflection of the underlying advertising landscape on these platforms, but also a reflection of what they make transparent. So for example, Google only makes transparent data from or substantially about federal candidates or office holders. And that's just a much narrower criteria than Facebook provides. So I just want to pause here to see if there are any questions on this background stuff before we move on to the next section. And I don't think I can see the chat, so if someone can tell me if there are any questions or comments.
Hey, Laura, I'm not seeing any questions or comments.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we're really covering the Facebook ad library today, so let's move on to that. So, as I mentioned, there are some differing rules about which content are required to be disclosed. But for Facebook, in the United States, advertisers are required to disclose ads that are about social issues, elections, or politics. And Facebook actually has a pretty well-developed list of specific topics that they require disclosure around. And they also require advertisers to provide an accurate disclosure string that names the entity that pays for the ad. And they have a standard format for this disclosure string. Basically, it should just be the name of the entity without the use of any acronyms and without any kind of extraneous language like, not authorized by the candidate, or perhaps some additional ID number. It's just supposed to be the name of the business, not like with an address or anything like that. And if you want to, you can go look at the library right now, and you can search for any topic by keyword. And so I've just done like a little example search here for NYU, and here are a couple currently running ads. And for any particular ad you want to see, you can click on it and you can see this detail, which has the, as you can see, the ad image, the ad text, some information about the number of people who have seen the ad, the amount of money that was spent, where it was shown, and some demographic breakdown of to whom it was shown. So these impression and spend numbers update roughly daily. And so if we were to request this ad at some point in the future, these numbers may go up. Let's see. And also Facebook makes available a report that on every day or so, there is a newly published report where you can see for either all of history or for the last day, the last week, I believe the last 30 days and the last 90 days, it will show all the pages, the combination of pages and disclosure strings that ran content in the ad library, and the number of ads that had impressions during that time, and the amount of money that was spent on those ads during that time. So this is another source of information that we can use. So the ad library API, which is what we use to get information from the ad library, it gives access to the same underlying data set as the web portal. It is searchable by keyword string or page ID, notably not by date, unfortunately, although somewhat unusually, you can search by an empty string, and that's sort of how you can say, let me have everything. There is no direct link within the API. You can't like directly download an image or a video, but you can get a link to a composed ad from which you can extract the image or the video. So most data that's provided through the web portal are also available through the API. There's a couple of exceptions of this, most notably whether the ad is active or not active. That's available through the web portal, but not through the API. And also, if the ad has been removed for a policy violation of some kind, you can see that through the web portal. You can't see it through the API. And the reason that I'm going through this is, yes, one, in case you're interested in this, but also to give you some context of the data we have available to try to get through get a better understanding of the security of this system. So clearly, this system has two overriding goals. One, making the ads themselves, the content, transparent to users, not just who saw the ads, but to any user. And then second, there's a goal of disclosing accurately who paid for the content. So we have some questions basically around how well are these systems working, and how easy or difficult are they to evade. So really the first question we have is just, how good is Facebook at enforcing this disclosure policy? But the problem is this question is not really answered. Actually, I'm going to take a quick pause here. Were there any questions on that overview of the Facebook ad library itself before I move on to the security section of the presentation?
Hey, Laura, I'm not seeing any questions.
Great, thanks. Okay, so yeah, we really can't answer this question. And the reason that we can't answer it is we really don't have a third-party source of data right now. There's been times when we have, but there isn't one currently available. So this really isn't a question we can answer. But what we can answer is something related but slightly different, and that is, how good are advertisers at voluntarily disclosing ads that meet the criteria for inclusion in the ad library? And this we can actually start to get at, because if an advertiser doesn't voluntarily disclose an ad as meeting the criteria for inclusion, and it isn't immediately rejected, it can still wind up in the ad library later. And this can happen in one of a few ways. One, users can report it. And two, Facebook will continue to evaluate ads after after they're initially created. We've been told by Facebook that that system prioritizes ads based on based on how many people are seeing them. So it is at least in some ways being optimized for impact. But what that means is that we can take a look and find ads that are in the ad library that don't have a disclosure string, because these are ads that were initially not voluntarily disclosed and were sort of captured later. So the graph I'm showing you here, I have to apologize. I know there are a lot of lines, but we'll walk through them. So the dashed lines are from two categories of advertisers who I will get into in a little bit, but in general, the blue dashed line represents advertisers who never disclose who pays for their ads. They never voluntarily disclose any ads. And the green line is from advertisers who these particular ads ran in an undisclosed way, but those advertisers eventually did disclose a payer. And the reason that we separate them out is because they represent two patterns of behavior. Mixed disclosing advertisers are ones that our intuition about them is that they were initially unaware of the disclosure requirements, but after their ads were pulled, they provided a disclosure string and they were attempting to be transparent. Advertisers who do not ever provide any kind of disclosure string, they represent probably two other types of behavior. One, the person who ran a who ran maybe just a few political ads, doesn't want to disclose and is therefore deterred from running political ads. And two, someone who's just going to persistently not engage in this disclosure system. And so we sort of see these as different patterns of behavior, and we wanted to separate them out. But one of the things that we can see is that there isn't a real change over time. That behavior does not significantly get better over the course of the ad library. I'm going to note here that we believe our data to be right censored. So the last roughly 2 weeks of this graph are probably artificially low, because it takes time for ads to be caught, and therefore in the last 2 weeks, they haven't, the undisclosed ads from that period have just not all been found yet. So should note that. And the solid lines here represent the overall percentage of the total, because while there's definitely many of these undisclosed ads. In the time period in which we did this study, there are about 350,000 undisclosed ads. That's really a small percentage of the overall total. It's less than 10%. It's about 9% in fact. So while this number shifts over the course of the study period, it's really always at a fairly low amount a fairly low percentage. So, the answer is that advertisers have gotten a bit better, but there is a problem with persistent non-disclosure. And, so specifically, we do see a small spike in not disclosing advertising content in November of 2018, and we see a much larger spike in April going into May of 2019. And those actually correspond with major political events. So, that's why we can say that there is this problem with persistent non-disclosure. So, the next question that we wanted to think a little bit about is just how useful are these disclosure strings for understanding which entities are spending money on political advertising? I mean, this is potentially a way of identifying people who aren't, who are not permitted by the platforms to be spending money, particularly. And it's also a way of just getting an understanding of spending overall. So we took a look at these disclosure strings and we did an analysis of them, and we were looking for a few things. One, something that immediately stands out is, when we look at the pages who are advertisers who have run ads, a lot of them never, never give a disclosure string. So in fact, 54% never provide a disclosure string at all. Another 13% of the pages that advertise in the library, they do eventually provide a disclosure string, but they've run content that didn't have a disclosure string, and that portion of spend is something that we just never, is never disclosed. So theoretically, a correction could be made there, though, where if we were to say take that later disclosure string and apply it to that earlier spend, that would help to get a better understanding. And the last line item here, typos. So as I mentioned earlier, the disclosure strings that are provided are just free text entry strings. They're provided by the advertiser. And a thing to note is that the way advertising on Facebook works is that a page can designate multiple people to be authorized to run ads for that page. And what this means is that maybe one person who's running ads creates one version of the disclosure string and another person creates a version that's slightly different. Maybe it has a space at the end or it has a typo. And we find this actually in a surprisingly large number of cases. And this, as you can see, it particularly affects, it has a disproportionate impact on larger advertisers. So, and we believe that is because it's often, this is just a situation of human error where, there are multiple people running accounts, they don't enter quite the same string, and then this kind of scattered spend can happen. And so what we did to try and de-skew this is we ran basically some fuzzy matching where we tried to correct minor typos. We tried to cluster disclosure strings that were really only a small distance apart. And we also corrected for some other common violations of Facebook's rules for how disclosure strings are formatted that are often the cause of these fractured disclosure strings. So this would be something like one disclosure string has, organization name, and another has organization name website. So we would just cut off that website at the end. So there were a few common patterns. And using this method, we were able to find, so these are the percentages that were misattributed, but we used these when we were able to find these misattributions, we were able to aggregate the spend and impression data together with that other disclosure string. And this is something we're going to use in a little bit. So, to answer this question of how useful are these disclosure strings, the answer is that they aren't. This is something that's not working very well, and this is actually something that Facebook has acknowledged. So, starting very soon. Actually, this might have already started. They were on a slightly delayed time schedule on this. So Facebook has announced that they are no longer going to use these free text entry disclosure strings, that they will be requiring advertisers who run content that meets the criteria for inclusion in the transparency archives to vet their provide proof of who their organization is, and then Facebook will be creating the strings so that they consistently meet the format that's been specified. So we really view that as a really useful step forward. And so lastly, and this is really the meat here, can we use the information that has been made transparent to find violations of Facebook's policies? And that's going to be the last section of this presentation. So I'm just going to pause here again to see if there are any questions about that security review.
Hello, Laura, no questions.
Great. Okay. So moving on to what our primary finding, which was a method to find undisclosed coordinated activity. So what is undisclosed coordinated activity? Advertisers are required to truthfully disclose who pays for an ad that meets the criteria for inclusion in the library. And when they don't do that, then this violates Facebook's policies, and Facebook has periodically banned advertisers who engage in coordinated inauthentic behavior. And this is a slightly more specific term. And what coordinated inauthentic behavior is, well, I think the easiest thing to do is just show you an example of this is actually properly disclosed coordinated activity. So in this case, these various Facebook groups, Left Out Loud, Melanin, Raising Tomorrow, and the Soldier Network, these are Facebook groups that are aimed at different identity groups. So Left Out Loud, I believe that's just a left, like a left-leaning political group generally. Melanin is aimed at Black users. Raising Tomorrow is aimed at parents. The Soldier Network is aimed at veterans. And these groups, and there were others like this, they just consistently, they had content that was aimed at their specific identity group. So Melanin mostly ran content relating to African American culture. Raising Tomorrow mostly ran content about parenting, but they would also inject these explicitly political messages. And but this is actually properly disclosed. So you can see here that they all say that they are paid for the New American Media Group. What we're really looking for, and what is a violation of Facebook's policies, is if you don't disclose that these are all the same organization. If you try to pretend that they are somehow not that this is not coordinated activity. So that's really what we're looking for. And, but, so in terms of whether this is, what the way Facebook describes this as coordinated inauthentic behavior, I mean, I don't really, as a computer scientist, have any way of knowing whether something is inauthentic or not, but I can probably tell if it's coordinated, and I can tell if it's undisclosed. So that's why we go after this thing that is adjacent, if not the exact same thing. And I just want to tell you briefly about the tool we're going to use to do this. So in order to, what we're really looking for is content that is extremely similar in a way that isn't around the topic. It's more around understanding authorship, as in, I think that this document is nearly the same, maybe a word or two changed, but it's really nearly the same. And so the way that we do that is we use a tool called sim hashing. This is a locality sensitive hashing technique. And the way it really works is by shingling the document and then calculating the Hamming distance. So if you, something else that uses a conceptually very similar technique is if you're familiar with how image compression works by shingling, it's pretty similar. So so that's just a tool I want to introduce that we're going to be using. So I'm going to be swapping back and forth between this slide that gives a visual representation of our methodology and a textual description. But just to start, over on the left, we have a few example ads. And what we do is we calculate a sim hash for the text of each ad, and then we calculate an overall sim hash index for the entire body of ads. And then we can understand, roughly speaking, how similar or not similar the system is overall. So once we establish, what near identical means in this ecosystem, then we can say, okay, well, we've clustered our near identical ads, and in practice for this set of documents, that means that at most 2 or 3 words have differed, which differs slightly based on the length of the document, but just think 2 to 3 words and you've got it. And then we just ask the question, okay, for each of these clustered ad texts, how many disclosure strings, what's the mean number of disclosure strings per ad cluster? And this is where that earlier work of disambiguating those disclosure strings and being able to fuzzy match disclosure strings is very helpful, because we really know that if we see multiple disclosure strings for an ad cluster, that it's not just a typo, because we've already corrected for that. So we can establish the mean number of disclosure strings per ad cluster, and then we can establish a cutoff to say, well, if we see a cutoff, if a cluster has the number of disclosure strings has a z-score of 2 or more, which is to say 2 standard deviations above the mean, then this is an outlier in terms of number of disclosure strings that are associated with that text. And in practice, this number comes out to be 3. If we see 3 or more disclosure strings, that's an outlier. So that's really this step 1 of saying this is an undisclosed similar ad cluster. So now we have these ad clusters that we know are outliers in some way, and we're gonna park that very briefly, because the other thing we have to do is we have to say, for ad clusters that are associated with more than one page, how frequently does that happen, right? Because if it only happens once, right, that's theoretically a coincidence. So we wanted to see when this does happen, when an ad cluster is associated with more than one page, what's the mean number of times that happens, and again, establish a cutoff score so that we can sort of say empirically, okay, if this happens this number of times or more, then that's not just a coordinated behavior once, it's coordinated behavior over time. So this number also comes out to be 3, by the way. So here we have, these 2 cutoffs by which we make this second kind of grouping, where we're going to say, so we'll go through all the clusters that are these kinds of outlier clusters, and if the pages that are associated with those clusters, if those pages ran ads, if so, more than 3 times or more, then we're going to say that those 2 pages engaged in undisclosed coordination. And we will aggregate, we will agglomerate clusters together to create these page clusters or page groupings. So I'm just going to pause here and just ask quickly any questions on that. That's the sort of the sort of meatiest part of the presentation. No? Okay, moving on. So what do we find when we use this method? Well, interestingly, we find several different types of, several different patterns of this type of behavior. Something that I'm sure won't surprise everyone, we find some corporate astroturfing. So these pages all run many ads, you know, along the same lines. This is actually somewhat of a reflection of just offline coordinated behavior. Dubious commercial activity. We find quite a few sort of fake loan programs, fake health insurance, gold coin scams, that kind of thing. And again, you know, one of these ads wasn't disclosed at all. The other ones disclosed different pairs, but again, these pages all consistently run the same, you know, are advertising the same thing. Clickbait. We find quite a bit of clickbait, and interestingly, this category of ad just never ever seems to use disclosure strings, right? These are the clusters that engage in this behavior. They yeah, they just never disclose anything. And then lastly, and I think the thing we're all here for, and is inauthentic communities. So that's stuff like this. It's, you know, it's a political ad. In this case, these ads weren't voluntarily disclosed, and it, you know, runs widely. Here's another one. Gathering Together is actually a page aimed at Black women. Union Patriots is a page aimed at union members. These do have disclosure strings, but as you can see, they disclose that they're separate entities. They're not. So this is an interesting example of geographic specialization. So we see a lot, I've shown you a lot of examples of identity group specialization, but this one, these are aimed at Facebook users in different states, in this case, Virginia, Nevada, and Colorado. Angry Buckeyes is Ohio, Union Patriots is unions, you've seen that one, and Pennsylvania, obviously, again, these are, you know, not actually separate organizations. And yeah, so there's just a lot of this kind of content, and this is probably what we're really here to find, and we turn up quite a bit of it. And so yeah, the last thing I just want to quickly mention then is where we're going from here. That, you know, the next few things we're going to be working on is, you know, so far we've been really focused on this near identical matching for finding this kind of undisclosed coordinated activity, but we're going to be extending this so that we can better cluster ads by the ad campaign, not the political campaign, but like an ad campaign, the central idea. And we're also working on extracting more metadata. And the reason we're doing these two things is we think those are really the key tasks in building a screening system to allow, you know, to allow better screening for disinformative content in general. And so just very briefly, the conclusions from this, you know, from this initial review is we think transparency can work. You know, we were able to make very good use of the information that's been made transparent, and we would encourage other platforms to, you know, to follow Facebook's model of making a lot of content transparent. I think that the tactics to spread disinformation are still evolving, and, you know, we've seen a lot of change in the year that we've been following this. And lastly, we think that, you know, all parties involved need to invest more time and money in solving this problem. I think users need to change their behavior, and I think platforms and researchers just need to spend more time and money on this problem. And I have just a couple of minutes left for questions. But yeah, any questions? Okay, I guess no questions, so I am going to hand it back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so Laura's presentation will be available on the CAE community website. Let me go ahead and get that link for you guys, and I'll put it in the chat box so you guys can go and view not only the recording of today's talk, but also her presentation will be available on the site as well. If you guys are here for the next talk, that's going to start at 2, so we have a little bit of time. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll get right back into it.